When you look at the world around you, you believe you are simply observing something that is already finished, solid, and defined. But what if that impression were only a fraction of the truth? There is an invisible field sustaining every experience, and within it, consciousness is not merely a spectator. It participates, influences, and shapes what we call reality. This idea, often seen as a mystery between science and spirituality, opens the way for a deeper understanding of who we are and of the role we play in the flow of life. Throughout this journey, we will explore how consciousness, when seen through the quantum lens, can be understood as an active force capable of reorganizing our perceptions, emotions, and choices, revealing a universe that is more alive and responsive than we usually imagine. Speaking of quantum consciousness means entering a territory where science and philosophy meet to expand the limits of what we understand as reality. The term does not simply mean that the mind functions like a particle laboratory, but rather that there are profound parallels between the principles of quantum physics and the way consciousness manifests. If, in the classical world, reality seems rigid, predictable, and mechanical, in the quantum perspective, we find a universe where uncertainty, probability, and interconnection are the rule. In this scenario, consciousness can no longer be treated as something isolated within the brain, but as an active part of a field that permeates everything. Quantum physics has shown us that the act of observing influences the behavior of subatomic particles. This phenomenon, known as the observer effect, shook the traditional way of thinking about the material world. It was once believed that reality existed objectively, independently of any witness, but experiments revealed that the result depends, in part, on the conscious interaction that observes the process. When transposed to human experience, this suggests that consciousness does not only interpret facts, but participates in their creation. Thus arises the idea of quantum consciousness, a field where thought, perception, and intention are not mere reactions, but forces that shape what we live. It is important to note that quantum consciousness is not a replacement for physics or an escape into mysticism. It is an operational metaphor, a way of translating into human language what happens at subtle levels of reality. When looking at quantum principles such as superposition, the ability of something to exist in multiple states until a choice is made, we can reflect on the countless possibilities that the human mind keeps open. Our decisions, even small ones, function as wave collapses, selecting one among infinite possible routes. Another essential concept is quantum entanglement, in which two particles remain connected regardless of distance, reacting simultaneously to changes in one another. This connection resonates with the human experience of interdependence. Thoughts, emotions, and actions do not occur in isolation. They reverberate in invisible networks of relationships, influencing not only ourselves, but also the contexts in which we are inserted. Quantum consciousness, in this sense, invites us to abandon the illusion of separation and to understand that every gesture has an impact that goes beyond the immediate. From a psychological point of view, considering consciousness as a quantum field broadens the boundaries of what we understand as mind. The mind is not just the flow of thoughts we can identify, but also a reservoir of potentials, subtle memories, intuitions, and non-linear perceptions. Just as in quantum physics, one cannot precisely predict the state of a particle without considering the whole, it is also not possible to understand the mind without recognizing the influence of the body, the environment, and the network of relationship. There are those who argue that quantum consciousness is only a poetic analogy, an attempt to give spiritual shine to scientific terms. But in practice, the strength of this concept lies in its applicability. When we think that our perceptions directly influence how events present themselves, we cease to be passive spectators of life. We gain responsibility. If we are in a mental state filled with fear, it is as if the collapse of possibilities tends to align with that frequency. On the other hand, when we cultivate states of clarity, trust, or gratitude, we influence the field in a way that favors outcomes more coherent with these qualities. This view does not deny the existence of limits, structures, and objective forces that govern nature, but it affirms that within these laws there is a vibrant space where consciousness can act. It is like navigating a river. We do not control the course of the water, but we can learn to steer the boat with more precision, taking advantage of the currents in our favor. Quantum consciousness is precisely this art of recognizing that we are immersed in a dynamic flow and of realizing that our way of observing alters the course of the crossing. When we translate this into everyday life, we realize that each thought becomes a seed sown in a fertile field. The repetition of a mental pattern is equivalent to always watering the same plant, strengthening its presence in the garden of experience. What we call reality is, to a large extent, the accumulated result of these conscious or unconscious choices. Therefore, learning to define quantum consciousness is not just about elaborating an abstract theory, but about assuming that there is a real space of influence in our own hands. Thus, quantum consciousness can be understood as the ability to perceive oneself as part of a larger field, in which observation, intention, and emotion not only describe the world, but help build it. This definition opens the way for a radical change. Life ceases to be something that happens to us and becomes a dance of co-authorship, in which each instant is a point of decision, a potential not yet collapsed. Reality, from this perspective, becomes a living organism in constant dialogue with those who observe it. When we speak of mind, we almost always think of a set of thoughts that pass through our consciousness. However, this limited view ignores the vibrant complexity of what we really are. The mind cannot be reduced to a chemical flow in the brain or to a series of isolated electrical reactions. It functions as an energy field, an invisible fabric that interconnects body, emotions, and environment. This perspective broadens our understanding and allows us to see that the mind is not only an internal space of elaboration, but also a phenomenon that extends beyond physical boundaries. Several studies in neuroscience show that the brain emits detectable electromagnetic patterns, and that these patterns vary according to emotional and cognitive state. What we call brain waves are not just technical signals. They reveal that our thoughts are expressed as frequencies. Each mental state creates its own energetic signature, which interacts with the surroundings. It is as if we are constantly transmitting and receiving information in an invisible spectrum, still little understood, but perceptible in its effects. The idea of the mind as an energy field helps to explain why emotionally charged environments influence our well-being. Entering a space where there is conflict or tension impacts us immediately, even if no one says a word. We feel in the body a weight, a discomfort, a dense vibration. The opposite is also true. When approaching someone who transmits serenity, our breathing tends to calm, and our own internal rhythm reorganizes. These everyday examples reveal that the mind is not an isolated island, but an energetic network that extends and resonates. If we consider that the mind is a field, we need to think of its dynamics as something alive, in constant movement. Just as a magnetic field can be altered by external forces, the mental field is transformed according to the experiences, memories, and intentions we cultivate. Repeated emotions create patterns, and these patterns structure the mind's energy field. This structure, in turn, influences how we perceive and react to the world. In this way, we not only think from the mind, but also live within the field it generates. By recognizing this energetic aspect, we begin to understand why attention is so powerful. Where we place our focus, there we concentrate energy. This concentration strengthens certain connections, nourishes emotional states, and shapes our experiences. The mind functions as a lens, but also as an antenna. It focuses and interprets, but also captures and transmits. The quality of this process defines not only what we feel, but also how we relate to others and how we shape the course of life. We can imagine the mind as a field similar to a garden. The seeds are thoughts and emotions that, when receiving energy and repetition, germinate and grow. Some become flowers that elevate the space, others, weeds that suffocate vitality. The state of the garden depends on the care we give, the conscious selection of what we want to cultivate, and the courage to prune what no longer serves. This work is silent, but profoundly transformative. When we learn to care for the field of the mind, reality itself seems to reorganize, because what we emit becomes more coherent with what we want to live. Another fundamental aspect is to realize that this field is not rigid. It is plastic, moldable, and capable of reorganizing quickly. This principle resonates with neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt and create new connections throughout life. Each time we choose a different perspective, each time we change the way we react, we are altering the energetic configuration of the mind. It is a continuous process of learning and updating, in which small changes can generate far-reaching effects. Thinking of the mind as an energy field also helps us to understand experiences that once seemed inexplicable, such as intuition or the feeling of foreboding. Many times, before information reaches us rationally, the field has already captured nuances, subtle signals, and invisible patterns. What we call the sixth sense may in fact be sensitivity to this energetic field, which operates in parallel with linear reason. This understanding brings responsibility. If what we feel and think reverberates as energy, we can no longer see ourselves as isolated entities. Each person is a source of influence, and the quality of that influence depends on the state of the field they maintain. Cultivating clarity, presence, and balance benefits not only those who practice it, but also everyone who comes into contact with that frequency. At the same time, remaining in patterns of fear, anger, or confusion feeds dense fields that spread and return in different forms. Therefore, considering the mind as an energy field is more than a metaphor. It is a practical key to understanding life. This view invites us to observe what we emit, to take care of the invisible ground in which our experiences sprout, and to assume that our influence goes beyond what is visible or audible. It is to recognize that by refining the state of the mind, we not only transform our own balance, but also contribute to the harmonization of the space in which we live. Quantum physics has revealed something unsettling and fascinating. The simple act of observing can alter the behavior of what is being observed. In classic experiments like the double slit, particles of light or matter behave differently depending on whether or not they are under the presence of an observer. This phenomenon is called the observer effect and breaks with the idea of a completely objective universe independent of consciousness. From that point, the inevitable question arises: to what extent is the reality we live shaped by the way we observe it? This is not just a scientific debate, but a reflection that touches our everyday experience. The observer is not a distant figure who watches events as if seated in an audience. He is implicated in everything that happens. Human consciousness, when it turns toward an event, illuminates it, delineates it, and gives it form. This invisible link between observer and reality suggests that what we call the world is not something static, but a dynamic interaction between energy, information, and consciousness. Imagine a room full of possibilities. Everything that exists there is in potential, but it only comes into prominence when the gaze fixes on it. What is not observed remains in the background, as if it had no relevance. Our life works in a similar way. What we choose to see grows stronger, gains weight, becomes concrete reality. What we ignore loses strength and slips into the shadows of existence. This process happens all the time, even without our noticing. It is as if the gaze were a kind of invisible brush that colors the canvas of reality. In the psychological field, this is evident. A person who constantly focuses on flaws and problems tends to live in a world marked by scarcity and limitations. Another, who chooses to turn their gaze to learnings and possibilities, even when facing difficulties, perceives reality as a fertile space for growth. What differentiates them is not necessarily the external situation, but the quality of the inner observer. This shows us that the way of observing has the power to collapse life's probabilities into tangible experiences. There is, however, a pitfall in this process. We confuse perception with absolute reality. When we are stuck in rigid belief patterns, the gaze becomes conditioned and reality seems to confirm our expectations. This creates a closed loop in which the observer reinforces the same version of the world. That is why science speaks of bias. Our way of observing can distort the data we receive, leading us to limited conclusions. Recognizing this bias is the first step to broadening the field of vision, and consequently, the very reality we experience. The link between observer and reality can also be perceived in subtle situations. Think of a conversation. When someone feels truly heard, their words flow differently, Their presence expands, their energy changes. The simple act of looking attentively transforms not only the other person, but the very quality of the interaction. This happens because observing is not passive. It is a creative act that reorganizes the shared space. This realization leads us to reflect on the responsibility of the gaze. If what we choose to observe gains form and strength, it is up to each of us to make the conscious choice of where to place our attention. It is not about denying difficulties or creating illusions of perfection, but about understanding that the way we approach each event can broaden or restrict the possibilities before us. The observer has the power to nourish expansive realities or to imprison himself in narrow versions of life. The invisible link between observer and reality also points to something greater: the active participation of consciousness in the very fabric of the universe. If at the quantum level, the presence of the observer alters the outcome, perhaps human reality is equally sensitive to the state of mind and attention. This thought opens doors not to a magical belief, but to a concrete practice. By training the gaze to see more clearly, by refining perception beyond conditioning, we make room for broader realities to manifest. We can compare this process to a photographer who, facing a landscape, chooses the angle, the lens, and the lighting. The scene may be the same, but the outcome changes completely according to the observer's choice. Life, in the same way, offers multiple perspectives. It is up to us to select the focus with which we record the experience, for it is that choice that determines the narrative we live. Deep down, to observe is to create. We do not create out of nothing, but from the interaction between infinite possibilities and the quality of the gaze we apply to them. This invisible link invites us to abandon the illusion of neutrality and to assume our participation in the process of living. When we recognize that we are co-authors of reality, everyday life takes on a new meaning. Each gesture of attention becomes an act of creation, and each instant reveals itself as an opportunity to open different paths. Thus, the observer is not just a witness, but an essential part of the universe that manifests. Reality is not out there, waiting to be discovered in a neutral way. It reveals itself in the encounter between consciousness and energy, in the invisible space where gaze and world meet and transform each other. Much of what we live is not the direct product of the conscious mind, but of the silent force that works behind the scenes, the subconscious. It is not just a repository of old memories or a storehouse of forgotten information, but an active field that shapes decisions, perceptions, and emotions. The conscious mind, which we believe to be the driver of life, is like the visible tip of an iceberg. Meanwhile, the subconscious, vast and hidden, moves currents that direct our experience in a profound way. From a neuroscientific point of view, the subconscious is responsible for automatic processes such as breathing, heartbeat, and countless habits we repeat without thinking. However, its influence goes beyond biological functions. It also stores beliefs, emotional impressions, and behavior patterns that determine how we interpret the world. If from an early age we learn that life is dangerous, the subconscious keeps that information and filters reality through it. Thus, even in the face of neutral situations, the interpretation will be shaped by the lens of insecurity. This silent operation shows why so often we feel we cannot change life by willpower alone. The conscious mind can formulate clear goals, but if the subconscious operates in the opposite direction, the mind's energy field continues to recreate old patterns. It is like rowing against the current. No matter how much effort is made, the hidden force steers the boat toward the already established course. What we call the repetition of negative experiences is not chance, but the persistence of subconscious programs that have not yet been transformed. In the quantum perspective, the subconscious functions like a frequency that vibrates continuously, emitting signals to the field of possibilities. These signals attract compatible experiences, not by a magical mechanism, but because the mind tends to select and reinforce what resonates with what is already engraved in its core. If someone carries the belief that they are not worthy of love, that subconscious conviction guides choices, behaviors, and even the way they interpret others' gestures. The result is a reality that repeatedly confirms the internal narrative. This realization may seem limiting, but it also opens space for transformation. The subconscious, although powerful, is not immutable. It can be reprogrammed through new experiences, practices of attention, and intense emotional states that record new information. This is the point at which quantum consciousness manifests as a concrete possibility. By recognizing that our reality is born from subconscious patterns, we gain the chance to intervene, to plant new seeds in the hidden field of the mind. An everyday example helps to understand. Imagine someone who, since childhood, has heard that money is a source of suffering. This subconscious record creates a field of repulsion. Whenever there is an opportunity to prosper, an inner discomfort arises, a tendency to self-sabotage or avoid the chance. To change this dynamic, it is not enough to think positively about abundance. It is necessary to dive into the subconscious and record a new association in which prosperity connects to well-being and freedom. This process requires repetition and emotional intensity, as if it were necessary to teach the mind's energy field a new melody. Moreover, the subconscious is also sensitive to what we call expanded states of consciousness. Moments of deep relaxation, meditation, or introspection create conditions in which the barriers of the conscious mind soften, allowing new information to penetrate the subconscious core. In this space, we can introduce images, emotions, and intentions capable of restructuring the oldest patterns. What seemed like rigid programming begins to open to new possibilities, allowing the external experience to align with more conscious choices. The relationship between subconscious and reality also manifests in dreams. During sleep, the conscious withdraws, and the subconscious expresses itself through symbols and narratives. These often enigmatic dreams reveal hidden aspects of our psyche and show how we interpret the world at depth. Observing dreams is a way to dialogue with this hidden field, an opportunity to notice which programs are active and silently influencing daily life. It is important to emphasize that the subconscious is not an enemy, but an ally that simply repeats what has been recorded in its memory. It does not judge, question, or distinguish between what does us good or harm. It merely executes the programs it has received. Therefore, becoming aware of its role is essential. Instead of fighting it, we can learn to reorient it, nourishing it with new impressions and tending the seeds we allow to sprout in its fertile ground. In the end, understanding the subconscious as a creative force is recognizing that reality is not born only from what we rationally think. It is the fruit of a constant dialogue between conscious and unconscious, between the visible and the invisible. Each emotion, each past experience, and each unexamined belief composes a mosaic that manifests in our life. By illuminating this hidden territory, we regain the power to participate actively in the creation of experience, transforming old patterns into new horizons. Throughout life, we learn to regard emotions as internal reactions, almost always unpredictable, that arise in the face of the situations we confront. But there is a deeper dimension. Emotions are not just responses. They are frequencies that emit constant signals to the field of reality. Each emotion works like a vibration that colors the way we perceive the world and at the same time influences what we attract, reinforce, or reject. In this sense, living is not merely going through events, but interacting with them through the emotional frequency we carry. Science has already shown that emotions alter our body immediately. States of fear or anger accelerate the heart, raise cortisol levels, and leave the organism on alert. On the other hand, emotions such as gratitude or joy regulate the nervous system, stabilize breathing, and produce a sense of coherence between mind and body. These effects are not merely subjective, they can be measured. If the body reacts to each emotion as if it were a frequency, it is natural to think that this vibrational field also influences the space around us. When we are in a state of anxiety, for example, perception narrows. Everything seems like a potential threat, and the mind filters only information that confirms this state. Conversely, when we cultivate serenity, perception widens, and the field of possibilities opens. The same situation can be lived in radically different ways, depending on the predominant emotion. It is as if the world were a blank canvas and emotion the paint with which we outline reality. This explains why two people facing the same challenge can have such different experiences. One sees insurmountable barriers and becomes paralyzed. The other, even recognizing the difficulties, feels the energy to act and transform the circumstance. The difference lies not only in rational analysis, but in the emotional frequency that guides the gaze and directs choices. Thus, emotions not only describe our experience, they actively help shape what we live. This perspective also reveals the risk of ignoring or repressing emotions. When we do not acknowledge what we feel, the energy remains active, silently influencing our thoughts and behaviors. Unexpressed fear keeps vibrating in the inner field, attracting situations that reinforce the sense of vulnerability. Suppressed anger manifests in bodily tensions or sudden outbursts. Therefore, the key is not to deny emotions, but to recognize them and transform them into frequencies more aligned with what we wish to experience. The practice of observing emotions with awareness creates a space of choice. Upon noticing that we are vibrating in anxiety, we can breathe, shift focus, and reorient the energy. This change, though subtle, alters the emitted frequency, and consequently, the way reality organizes itself around us. It is like tuning a radio station. A small adjustment is enough to change the content we hear completely. We can understand emotions as energetic compasses. Fear points to where we feel risk. Anger signals where we perceive injustice. Sadness indicates a loss or the need for withdrawal. Joy, enthusiasm, and gratitude, in turn, point to states of expansion, connection, and openness. By interpreting these compasses, we have the chance to direct consciousness and choose which frequencies we want to reinforce. This choice is not only psychological, but vibrational, and it directly impacts the reality we co-create. A clear example lies in the power of gratitude. Studies show that people who cultivate the practice of giving thanks develop greater emotional resilience, better physical health, and more balanced relationships. Gratitude functions as a frequency of expansion that reorganizes the internal and external field. When we look at life from that state, reality tends to offer new opportunities, as if the surrounding field responded to the emitted vibration. Recognizing emotions as frequencies also means accepting that they are transmissible. An environment in which fear predominates infects those who enter it. Likewise, a group that vibrates confidence and enthusiasm inspires its members to express the best in themselves. Each of us is a transmitter and a receiver, continually influencing and being influenced by the collective field. The responsibility, therefore, is twofold: to care for one's own emotions and to recognize that they extend beyond us, participating in the invisible weaving of shared life. This care does not require perfection, but awareness. It is not about avoiding negative emotions, but about learning to transmute them and not letting them dominate the field for a prolonged time. Deep down, understanding emotions as a frequency that shapes the real is to realize that each moment offers us a choice: to reinforce patterns of limitation or to emit vibrations that open paths. This awareness turns life into a living laboratory where each emotion is an opportunity to align energy and reality. And here, I ask you to pause and reflect. Which emotion has been the dominant frequency in your life in recent days? Write in the comments a single word that sums up that emotion. By sharing, you not only bring clarity to yourself, but also strengthen the collective energy of this space. And if this content brought you value, like this video so that more people can discover the power of shaping reality through emotional consciousness. When speaking about quantum consciousness, it is common for some to see this field as something abstract or merely philosophical. However, contemporary science has produced discoveries that bring this view closer to a concrete basis. Although there is still much debate, there are studies showing that the relationship between mind, matter, and the quantum field cannot be dismissed. This evidence does not settle the issue, but offers footholds for thinking more broadly about the participation of consciousness in the construction of reality. One historical milestone is the already cited double-slit experiment, which showed how particles can behave like waves, maintaining multiple possibilities until an observation is made. This discovery opened the way to think that the act of observing is not neutral, but capable of influencing outcomes. What once seemed like a technical detail turned into a philosophical key. If this occurs at the subatomic level, what implications might it have for human consciousness? Another expanding field is research on cardiac coherence and its relationship with emotional states. The HeartMath Institute in the United States has studied how emotions of compassion, love, and gratitude generate more coherent patterns in heart rhythm, which in turn influence the functioning of the brain and the nervous system. These states of coherence are not restricted to the individual body, but also seem to affect the surrounding environment, creating a field of resonance that other people can perceive. Although this is not directly quantum physics, these findings reinforce the idea that emotions and consciousness have a measurable impact on reality. In neuroscience, brain plasticity has also brought significant evidence. For decades, it was believed that the brain was fixed after a certain stage of development. Today we know it is highly adaptable, capable of reorganizing its connections in response to new learning, meditative practices, and intense emotional experiences. This confirms that the mind is not imprisoned in immutable structures, but is a dynamic system in constant dialogue with conscious choices and perceptions. This adaptability connects directly with the quantum view of reality as a field of possibilities. Research in physics also points to the existence of quantum entanglement, a phenomenon in which two particles remain connected, even at great distances, responding instantaneously to changes in one another. Although there is still no consensus on how this relates to consciousness, some scholars see in this phenomenon a parallel with human experiences of interconnection. Reports of distant intuitions, synchronicities, and shared perceptions resonate with this principle. While not direct proof, they suggest that consciousness may operate at levels of invisible linkage. In addition, psychology has investigated the influence of expectation on objective outcomes, a phenomenon known as the placebo effect. Patients who believe they are receiving an effective treatment often show real improvements, even when the administered medication is inert. This effect reveals the power of the mind to reorganize physical processes, showing that belief and expectation can act as determining factors in the course of experience. This data reinforces the hypothesis that consciousness not only interprets, but also participates in constructing lived reality. Recently, the fields of physics and biology have begun to explore so-called quantum biology. Discoveries indicate that fundamental processes of life, such as photosynthesis in plants, and even the perception of smell in humans, involve quantum phenomena. This means that the quantum universe is not restricted to sophisticated laboratories, but manifests in living systems every day. In recognizing this, it becomes more plausible to think that consciousness, as a biological and energetic phenomenon, may also be deeply rooted in these principles. There are also advances in studies on meditation and altered states of consciousness, in which MRI scans show consistent changes in the brain activity of practitioners. These changes include greater balance between hemispheres, increased gray matter density in areas linked to attention and empathy, and a reduction in stress patterns. This evidence confirms that internal practices have external, measurable effects, bringing the subjective field of consciousness closer to concrete scientific data. Although science has not yet arrived at a unified theory of consciousness, the indications point to an increasingly clear movement. The rigid separation between mind and matter is dissolving. Consciousness can no longer be treated as an epiphenomenon isolated from the brain, but as something that actively interacts with the processes of the body and the universe. These recent discoveries do not end the debate, but they offer a basis for a renewed understanding. Science, with its rigor, does not seek to prove spiritual concepts, but its discoveries create room for ancient intuitions to be revisited in a new light. The link between observation, emotion, intention, and reality is gradually finding support in data that cannot be ignored. Thus, when we speak of quantum consciousness, we are not relying only on metaphors or philosophical views. There is a convergence underway between science and spirituality, where previously rigid boundaries begin to dissolve. Reality proves more flexible, more connected, and more sensitive to the presence of consciousness than we imagined. And perhaps this is only the beginning of a silent revolution in how we understand who we are and the universe we inhabit. For centuries, spirituality and science have walked in seemingly separate territories. The former sought meaning, transcendence, and connection with something greater than the individual. The latter sought objective, verifiable explanations for the phenomena of the world. However, as quantum physics developed, the boundaries began to soften. A fertile space arose in which spiritual concepts gained new interpretations, and in which science found metaphors that resemble ancient traditions of wisdom. At the base of spirituality is the perception that life is more than raw matter. From Eastern traditions to Western philosophies, consciousness has always been considered a central element, an invisible force that permeates existence. Quantum physics, in turn, has shown that material reality is not as solid as we imagined. The world, in its essence, is composed of energy in constant motion, in which particles appear and disappear, interacting at invisible levels. This discovery resonates with spiritual views that describe the universe as a living and dynamic fabric. One of the most intriguing meeting points lies in the concept of interconnection. Spiritual traditions have always asserted that everything is linked, that there is no real separation between beings and events. Quantum physics confirms this intuition through entanglement. Particles can remain connected even at immense distances, reacting simultaneously. What was once merely a spiritual metaphor today finds a parallel in the laboratory. This similarity does not mean that science and spirituality say exactly the same thing, but it reveals that both point to a more integrated reality than we supposed. Another link between the two fields lies in the importance of observation. Spirituality has always highlighted the power of the inner gaze, of mindful attention, and of conscious intention. The simple act of observing oneself was considered transformative. Quantum physics, in turn, has shown that observing particles modifies their behavior, suggesting that consciousness plays an active role in the formation of reality. Although the contexts are different, the essence is convergent. The observer participates in creating the world he perceives. Spirituality also speaks of elevated states of consciousness as paths to transcend the ego and access broader dimensions of being. Modern science, in investigating meditation, prayer, and contemplative practices, has found real changes in the brain and body of those who experience them. These practices expand the sense of connection, reduce stress patterns, and promote balance. At this point, spirituality and science complement each other. One offers symbolic language and practice. The other provides measurements and verifications. However, it is important not to fall into the trap of turning quantum physics into a mystical justification or spirituality into rigid science. The value of this connection lies in enabling dialogue, not in reducing one field to the other. Spirituality points to subjective dimensions of human experience that cannot be measured in a laboratory. Science, in turn, offers investigative tools that prevent us from falling into illusions or unfounded beliefs. When these two worlds meet with respect for their differences, powerful insights arise. This integration also helps to redefine our relationship with reality. In realizing that the universe is not merely a cold mechanism, but a living field of possibilities in which consciousness exerts influence, we open space for a more meaningful life. Spirituality offers meaning and direction, while science offers method and clarity. Together, they invite us to assume an active role as co-authors of experience, balancing faith and reason, intuition and analysis. A practical example can be found in the notion of healing. Spirituality has always maintained that inner balance is reflected in the body, and that states of peace promote health. Today, integrative medicine recognizes the impact of emotions and the mind on physiological processes. Quantum physics, by demonstrating that reality is shaped by the interaction between energy and observer, provides a metaphorical basis for understanding how spiritual practices can reorganize subtle patterns of the organism. It is not a matter of miracle, but of coherence between body, mind, and energy field. The bridge between spirituality and quantum physics also opens space for a deeper ethics. If everything is connected, our choices do not affect only ourselves, but reverberate through the collective fabric. Consciousness ceases to be an individual matter and becomes a shared responsibility. This principle, present in ancient traditions, gains new strength when supported by scientific discoveries that show interdependence at the quantum level. In the end, the true richness of this connection lies in reminding us that we do not need to choose between science or spirituality. Both are ways of investigating reality, each with its own language and limits. Quantum physics shows us that the universe is more mysterious than any single theory can encompass. Spirituality reminds us that, within this mystery, there is meaning and conscious participation. The meeting of the two fields does not resolve all questions, but places us before a broader vision, where living becomes a dance between investigation and surrender, between calculation and reverence. Understanding quantum consciousness conceptually is already transformative, but it is in practice that this vision becomes alive. Talking about energy, observation, and the field of possibilities has little effect if we do not make ourselves available to experience firsthand how these principles translate into everyday life. Expanding quantum consciousness is not an instant act, but a gradual process that requires presence, gentle discipline, and openness to perceive beyond habitual conditioning. One of the most effective practices is cultivating mindfulness. When we are conscious of the present, we interrupt the automatic tendency to relive memories or project fears into the future. Mindfulness is not only observing thoughts, but feeling the body, noticing the breath, perceiving the subtleties of the environment. This state reconnects us to the quantum field of the now, where multiple possibilities are open. Life ceases to be unconscious repetition and becomes a fertile space for new choices. Another key lies in cultivating emotional coherence. As we have seen, emotions function as frequencies that shape reality. Training oneself to enter states of gratitude, compassion, and serenity does not mean denying the existence of challenging emotions, but learning to transmute them. A simple example is transforming anger into energy for constructive action, or sadness into an opportunity for introspection and care. Each time we realign the emotional field, we expand our ability to create experiences more coherent with our deep desires. Contemplative practices such as meditation, prayer, or visualization are powerful tools in this process. They allow access to deeper layers of the subconscious, recording new information and reorganizing internal patterns. When we enter states of silence and connection, our mind opens to perceive subtleties that the rush of daily life prevents us from noticing. It is in this space that insights arise, that intuitions become clear, and that the sense of interconnection intensifies. Meditation, for example, has already shown in scientific studies the ability to alter brain structure, increasing areas linked to empathy and attention. The body also plays an essential role in expanding quantum consciousness. It is not just a vehicle of the mind, but part of the energy field. Practices such as conscious breathing, yoga, tai chi, or even mindful walking help integrate body and mind into the same rhythm. When we breathe deeply and evenly, the nervous system stabilizes, and the mental field becomes more receptive to new perceptions. The body becomes an ally for expanding states of consciousness, functioning as a bridge between the visible and the invisible. Another fundamental path is observing thoughts. The conscious mind produces thousands of ideas every day, but we rarely pause to notice which patterns are being reinforced. By observing these thoughts without judgment, we gain clarity about the kind of reality we are feeding. This clarity opens space for more conscious choices. We can replace limiting narratives with affirmations that reflect new possibilities. This process, repeated consistently, reprograms the subconscious and alters the frequency we emit to the field. It is also important to develop the practice of inner silence. We live in a world saturated with stimuli and often confuse movement with progress. But the expansion of consciousness requires pauses, moments when we withdraw from external noise to listen to what is happening inside. Silence is not emptiness. It is fertile space where the mind reorganizes, where intuition can emerge more clearly. By cultivating this silence, we learn to access levels of perception that do not depend on linear reasoning. Relationships are also a fertile field for expanding quantum consciousness. Each interaction is an opportunity to observe how we react, what emotions are triggered, and how our internal state influences the other. By practicing deep listening and empathy, we create a shared field of energy that fosters more authentic connections. This quality of presence reminds us that we are not isolated, but interconnected in a network of mutual influences. In addition, the practice of conscious intention is one of the most transformative. When we bring clarity to our intentions, we are choosing which possibility we want to collapse in the quantum field. The difference between a vague desire and a clear intention is immense. Intention directs energy, organizes the internal field, and guides our actions. When we unite intention with elevated emotion, we create a powerful frequency capable of reorganizing experience. Expanding quantum consciousness, therefore, is not something reserved for monks or scientists. It is a practice accessible to everyone, beginning in small daily gestures, choosing to breathe before reacting, giving thanks before sleeping, truly listening to someone, pausing for a few moments to perceive the body itself. Each conscious act is a seed that expands our field of perception, bringing us closer to a life more aligned with our potential. The secret is not in performing these practices perfectly, but in cultivating them with consistency. Transformation does not happen overnight, but accumulates like drops filling a river. Little by little, the mind becomes clearer, emotions more balanced, and perception broader. In this process, reality ceases to be lived as a fixed destiny and comes to be understood as a field in constant dialogue with our consciousness. Quantum consciousness shows us that we are not just spectators of life, but co-authors of every instant. Thoughts, emotions, and intentions form a field that interacts with reality, revealing that the universe responds to the quality of our presence. When we learn to observe with clarity, to cultivate higher emotional states, and to consciously guide the subconscious, we realize that life ceases to be automatic repetition and becomes conscious creation. This vision is not just theory, it is daily practice made of small choices that accumulate and transform our way of living. If you made it this far, write "I create my reality" in the comments so I know of your presence until the end. And if this content made sense to you, subscribe to the channel to follow new reflections and deepen this journey even further.